There are moments that divide a life in two, a before and an after, a threshold you cross without knowing you'll never return. December 22nd, 1849, St. Petersburg. The morning hangs pale and exhausted, its light the color of old paper, and a row of men stand in the courtyard of the Semenovsky regiment waiting to die. They are prisoners, political criminals, young idealists who spoke too loudly in a country allergic to freedom. Snow falls in a slow, indifferent drift, flakes landing on faces clenched with terror, on trembling hands, on the rifles being raised. Among them stands Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky, 28 years old, his skin pale against the cold, his eyes cast downward as if he had already begun the slow separation from his own body. He listens to the scrape of boots on frost, the commands shouted like cracks in ice, the sound of metal being lifted into position. He thinks, this is what the end feels like. He murmurs one final prayer, not loud, not hopeful, just the reflex of a soul reaching for something, anything, beyond the moment. And then a sudden gallop, hooves crushing snow, a breathless voice shouting across the courtyard. A pardon, a last-second miracle, so cruel in its timing, it felt like mockery disguised as mercy. Instead of death, they would receive 4 years of hard labor in the frozen hell of Omsk. Instead of bullets, they would receive survival. Later, in a letter that trembles with the weight of what he had just lived through, Dostoevsky wrote, "When they read us the sentence, I thought, life is a gift, life is happiness, and every minute may be an eternity of joy. But here is the thing about surviving your own execution. You do not return to the world the same. Something in you dies anyway. The man who walked away from that courtyard was not the man who had stood in it. He was rawer, quieter, carved open. His nervous system remembered its own ending. And for the rest of his life, he would write not from observation, but from that wound, from the place where the self breaks apart and discovers what lies underneath." This is not a story about a writer. This is a story about a soul that descended into the darkest rooms of human existence. Guilt, suffering, shame, love, faith, despair, and returned with maps. Not answers, maps. Because Dostoevsky did not write to comfort you. He wrote to show you that you are not alone in the room you are most afraid to enter. Before he became the cartographer of human pain, he was the child who witnessed it. Dostoevsky grew up on the grounds of the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor, where his father, a stern military doctor, lived in the staff quarters with his family. Imagine Dostoevsky at 8 years old, wandering narrow corridors, where the sick moaned through thin walls, where doctors whispered in exhausted Russian, where death visited daily like a relative who no longer needed to knock. He saw peasants with frost-bitten fingers, mothers clutching dying children, beggars who entered groaning and left silent. His mother, gentle, luminous, tried to shield him, but the world was already carving itself into his imagination. Suffering was not abstract to him. It was the smell of wet cloth and fever, the sound of weeping behind closed doors, the way a body looked when hope had left it. He learned early that people are fragile, that pain is everywhere, that poverty has a texture you can feel in the air. Later, he would write, "Human beings are mysterious. It is necessary to try to unravel them, and if you spend your whole life, don't say it's a waste of time." This was not philosophy. This was autobiography. The hospital taught him that the soul does not exist in theory. It exists in trembling bodies, in hunger, in the quiet dignity of the forgotten. And he never forgot.
But nothing shaped him more than the 4 years he spent in the Siberian prison camp. He called it hell, and he was not exaggerating. The barracks were packed with murderers, thieves, men whose eyes looked like cracked windows through which madness blew. There were no books, no ink, no privacy, no softness, just cold violence and the smell of unwashed bodies pressed together in unforgiving confinement. He slept beside men who had killed without hesitation, men who had stolen, beaten, destroyed. And yet he found something there, something grim and miraculous. The damned still prayed, the broken still loved, the worst among them still wept. He discovered a truth that would shape every novel he would ever write. There is a drop of God in even the most fallen man.
The psyche does not divide cleanly into good and evil. It is a house with many rooms, some lit, some locked, some you enter only when you have no choice. In that prison, Dostoevsky walked through rooms most people spend their lives avoiding. He entered idealistic and left illuminated. He entered fractured and left whole in a new, trembling way. This is what suffering does when it is not resisted. It carves, it does not build. It removes what is false, and what remains is truer than what you started with. Most people think of suffering as punishment, an error, a wound to be healed as quickly as possible. But Dostoevsky understood something deeper. Suffering is not the enemy of the soul. It is the chisel. Pain breaks down the walls you've built to protect yourself from others, from truth, from God, from your own unlived life. It strips away pretense and reveals what you actually believe, not what you say you believe. Comfort allows you to live in illusion, but suffering forces you into reality. And reality, raw, unfiltered reality, is where the soul begins to grow.
This is not about glorifying pain. It is about recognizing that pain, when faced honestly, transforms. The self that emerges after breaking is not the same self that entered the fire. It is deeper, more spacious, more capable of holding contradiction. Dostoevsky wrote characters who suffered not because he was sadistic, but because he knew that suffering was the furnace where the soul was reforged. Raskolnikov does not heal through logic. He heals through collapse. Prince Mishkin does not teach through sermons. He teaches through his willingness to be wounded. Sonia does not save Raskolnikov with arguments. She saves him with presence, with her willingness to sit beside him in his shame. This is the architecture of redemption in Dostoevsky's world. You must descend before you can rise. You must break before you can integrate. You must confess before you can be whole.
And then there was his illness, epilepsy, the seizures that haunted him his entire adult life. But here is what most people do not know. Moments before collapsing, Dostoevsky experienced something extraordinary, a flash of transcendent bliss, an overwhelming sense of harmony, clarity, presence. He described it like this: I felt a harmony in myself and in the whole world. I felt so light, so joyful, that I would exchange all the years of my life for one moment of that ecstasy. And then darkness, convulsions, frothing, hours of confusion and unbearable shame. His art emerged from this violent contrast between divine ecstasy and human frailty, between transcendence and collapse, between the vision of wholeness and the reality of brokenness. His characters often experience sudden moments of clarity, followed by catastrophe. Raskolnikov's confession, Mishkin's seizures, Ivan Karamazov's fever dreams. This is not fiction. This is Dostoevsky writing from his own nervous system. His genius did not come from calm reflection. It came from wrestling with angels in the chambers of his own brain.
Dostoevsky entered prison a writer of social novels and left a writer of the human soul. He entered believing in reform, progress, reason, and left believing in grace, confession, and the terrifying mystery of free will. Suffering had not destroyed him, it had opened him. And what poured out was some of the most psychologically penetrating literature ever written. If you had to describe the human psyche in one image, what would you choose? Dostoevsky chose a house with many rooms. Some are lit, warm, familiar, safe. These are the parts of yourself you live in daily, your conscious identity, your public self, the version of you that knows how to behave. But there are other rooms, rooms you keep locked, rooms where you've shoved everything you don't want to see. Your shame, your rage, your unlived desires, your potential you're too afraid to claim. Jung would later call this the shadow, but Dostoevsky dramatized it decades earlier, not as theory, but as lived experience. His characters are people haunted by the rooms they refuse to enter, and the novels are about what happens when those doors finally break open. The psyche does not announce itself politely. It does not wait for you to be ready. It erupts when the pressure becomes unbearable, when the lie you've been telling yourself can no longer hold, when the locked room finally splinters from the inside. This is why his characters collapse, why they confess, why they break down in public squares and prison cells. Not because they are weak, but because the soul will not be silenced forever. What you repress does not disappear. It gathers force in the dark, and when it finally speaks, it speaks in fever, in dreams, in compulsions you cannot explain. Dostoevsky understood that the unconscious mind is not a theory to be debated. It is a force to be reckoned with. In 1846, long before Freud or Jung, Dostoevsky wrote a strange, feverish novella called The Double. It tells the story of a government clerk named Gulyadkin who meets a perfect copy of himself, a doppelganger. At first, the double is charming, confident, socially fluent, everything Gulyadkin is not. And slowly, the double begins to take over his life, appearing at his workplace, stealing his friendships, replacing him in every space he once occupied. This is not science fiction. This is psychology. The double is not an intruder from outside. The double is the part of Gulyadkin that he has refused to integrate, the assertive self, the confident self, the self that could succeed if only he would stop sabotaging himself. But Gulyadkin cannot accept this. He cannot bear to see that the person he most envies is the person he could have been. So the double becomes his enemy. And in the end, Gulyadkin descends into madness. Not because the double destroyed him, but because he could not bear to see himself clearly. Modern psychiatrists call this depersonalization, dissociation, the split ego. Dostoevsky wrote it in 1846. He understood that a human being can be divided against himself, that the mind can fracture without leaving a visible wound. This is what happens when you refuse to claim all the parts of yourself. They do not disappear. They become autonomous. They begin to live separate lives. And eventually, they come back to haunt you. In 1864, Dostoevsky created a character who would change literature forever. A man who hates himself, who loves the taste of his own humiliation, who sabotages friendships just to feel a moment of control. This man has no name. He calls himself a sick man, a spiteful man, a most unattractive man. This is the underground man, the spiritual ancestor of every modern anti-hero. Modern psychiatrists call this depersonalization, dissociation, the split ego. Dostoevsky wrote it in 1846. He understood that a human being can be divided against himself, that the mind can fracture without leaving a visible wound. This is what happens when you refuse to claim all the parts of yourself. They do not disappear. They become autonomous. They begin to live separate lives. And eventually, they come back to haunt you. In 1864, Dostoevsky created a character who would change literature forever. A man who hates himself, who loves the taste of his own humiliation, who sabotages friendships just to feel a moment of control. This man has no name. He calls himself a sick man, a spiteful man, a most unattractive man. This is the underground man, the spiritual ancestor of every modern anti-hero.
He is the voice of depression, the voice of self-sabotage, the voice of intellectual bitterness, the voice of the modern, disillusioned soul. He says things people are afraid to admit. I lie out of laziness. I am lazy out of fear. I fear because I am alive. He refuses happiness because happiness feels like surrender. He refuses progress because progress feels like obedience. He refuses human warmth because he hates the idea of needing anyone. The underground man is trapped in his own mind, watching himself think, critiquing himself in real time, unable to act because every impulse is immediately analyzed and dismantled. He is paralyzed by consciousness itself. And this is the birth of existentialism, a decade before Nietzsche, half a century before Sartre. Dostoevsky understood that excessive self-awareness can become a prison, that intelligence can become a curse, and that sometimes the most dangerous room in the house is the one where you sit alone, thinking.
What makes the underground man so disturbing is not that he is evil, it is that he is honest. He says out loud what most people only whisper to themselves in the dark. He admits that he sabotages his own happiness, not out of stupidity, but out of a perverse need to assert control over his life. If he cannot be happy on his own terms, then he will choose misery. At least that choice is his. This is the paradox of freedom that haunted Dostoevsky. Sometimes people choose suffering simply to prove they have the power to choose. Now we come to one of the most psychologically complex characters ever written, Rodion Raskolnikov, a brilliant, starving ex-student who wanders the streets of St. Petersburg like a man losing his outline. He has a theory. Extraordinary men have the right to step over moral boundaries for the sake of higher purpose. He thinks of Napoleon, of conquerors, of great men who break bodies to build history. And slowly, that theory becomes a parasite. It burrows into his mind, chewing at the edges of sanity, until one day, in a cramped apartment that smells of rancid oil, he murders a pawnbroker with an axe.
Then her innocent sister walks in, and suddenly Raskolnikov's theory collides with reality. The room spins, the blood pools, the murderer becomes a trembling child. Crime and punishment is not about the killing. It is about what happens next. The fever, the hallucinations, the paranoia dripping like sweat, the growing terror that he has not killed a woman. He has killed the image of himself he thought he could live with. Raskolnikov tries to convince himself he was right, that he is strong, that guilt is weakness. But the body knows, the dreams know, the hands shake. He cannot eat, cannot sleep, cannot think, because conscience is not cultural. It is bone deep.
Dostoevsky shows us that crime is not punished by law first, it is punished by the soul. And the soul is merciless. What Raskolnikov discovers is that you cannot think your way out of guilt. You cannot rationalize it, explain it away, or transcend it through philosophy. The psyche has its own justice system, and it operates below the level of conscious control. His illness is not a coincidence. It is his unconscious mind forcing him toward truth. Every fever dream, every moment of paranoia, every compulsion to confess is the soul's attempt to restore balance. Jung would later call this the self, the organizing principle of the psyche that moves toward wholeness whether the ego wants it to or not. Dostoevsky understood something that psychology would not articulate for decades. The unconscious mind is real and it prosecutes. Raskolnikov's guilt does not express itself as moral reasoning, it expresses itself as fever, delirium, compulsive confession. His psyche forces him toward truth, not because he wants to confess, but because the soul cannot bear the weight of a lie. This is what makes Dostoevsky's psychological realism so astonishing. He mapped the unconscious before it had a name. Jung would later say, "The shadow is the person you'd rather not be." Dostoevsky dramatized this long before Jung was born. His characters are people at war with themselves, and the war is not between good and evil. It is between the self they show the world and the self they hide in locked rooms. The only way to peace is integration. To open the door, to walk into the room you've been avoiding, to say, "This too is mine," not because it is good, but because it is real. And only what is real can be redeemed. This is why confession plays such a central role in Dostoevsky's novels. Confession is not about admitting guilt to an external authority. It is about acknowledging truth to yourself. It is the moment when the ego stops fighting the self, when the conscious mind finally sees what the unconscious has known all along. Raskolnikov's confession to Sonia is not a legal admission. It is a psychological breakthrough. The moment he speaks his crime out loud, something in him begins to heal. Not because the crime is erased, but because the lie is ended. Here is where Dostoevsky and Jung converge so completely that it feels like they were drawing from the same well. Jung gave us the map of the psyche, the ego, the shadow, the self, the process of individuation. But Dostoevsky gave us the experience, the fever, the trembling, the collapse, the slow, agonizing return to wholeness. Jung systematized what Dostoevsky dramatized. Both understood that the psyche is not a machine you can control through willpower. It is an autonomous system with its own intelligence, its own goals, its own methods of bringing you into alignment. Both understood that what you repress does not disappear. It goes underground and gathers strength. Both understood that wholeness is not achieved by eliminating the shadow, but by integrating it, by learning to hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into one side or the other. The soul as a house with locked rooms. This is not just a poetic metaphor. It is a precise description of how the psyche operates. Every part of yourself that you reject gets locked away in a room you refuse to enter. And those rejected parts do not sit quietly. They bang on the walls. They whisper through the vents. They show up in your dreams, your compulsions, your irrational reactions. And eventually, if you refuse to open the door, they break it down. Dostoevsky's characters are people who have locked away too many rooms for too long, and the novels are about what happens when those doors finally shatter. Raskolnikov locked away his guilt and it returned as fever. The underground man locked away his need for connection, and it returned as bitterness. Ivan Karamazov locked away his grief, and it returned as madness. The only path to healing is the same for all of them. Stop running, open the door, face what you have been refusing to see.
Dostoevsky gave us the map of the divided self. Jung gave us the language, but Dostoevsky gave us the experience, the fever, the trembling, the collapse, the slow, agonizing return to wholeness. And that is what makes his work unforgettable. In the ruins of Raskolnikov's mind, there appears a single light, Sofia Semyonovna Marmeladova, Sonia, a young woman forced into prostitution to feed her family. Quiet, trembling, almost invisible. But she carries something no one else in the novel has, unbroken compassion. When Raskolnikov confesses his crime, she does not recoil. She does not lecture. She weeps for him. She holds his shaking hands like they are the hands of a drowning man. And she becomes the novel's moral axis, the still point in a spinning universe.
Dostoevsky uses her to speak the line that defines his entire worldview. Go at once, this very moment. Stand at the crossroads, bow down, and say aloud to the whole world, I am a murderer. And then God will send you life again. Confession, not justice, resurrects Raskolnikov. Sonia is not strong because she is invulnerable. She is strong because she absorbs. She does not harden in the face of suffering. She softens. And in her softness, she becomes unbreakable. This is Dostoevsky's vision of love. Love is not about fixing. Love is about presence. Love does not demand that you become worthy first. Love sits beside you in your unworthiness and says, I see you, and I will not leave. Sonia does not have answers for Raskolnikov. She does not solve his philosophical crisis or explain away his guilt. She simply refuses to abandon him. And that refusal, that stubborn, illogical commitment to stay, is what begins to heal him.
What makes Sonia so radical is that she loves without condition, but not without truth. She does not excuse Raskolnikov's crime. She does not tell him it wasn't his fault or that he shouldn't feel guilty. She acknowledges the full weight of what he has done and loves him anyway. This is the paradox of redemptive love. It sees you completely, darkness and all, and chooses to stay. Not because it is blind to your faults, but because it understands that you are more than your worst moment. After the success of Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky attempted something almost impossible. He wanted to write a novel about a perfectly good human being, not a hero, not a genius, a man of pure, uncorrupted goodness. This man became Prince Lev Mishkin, the idiot. But Mishkin is not idiotic. He is luminous. He is gentle. He is a man untouched by the cynical machinery of society. His kindness is radical, almost frightening.
Dostoevsky wrote, "There is nothing more beautiful, nothing more difficult than being good." And Mishkin suffers because the world cannot handle that kind of light. He returns to Russia after years in a Swiss clinic for epilepsy, a reflection of Dostoevsky himself. He meets Nastasya Filipovna, a woman with a soul fractured by shame. He sees her not as ruined, but as wounded. He loves her with compassion, but she cannot believe she deserves tenderness, so she runs toward destruction. Prince Mishkin stands helpless as purity collides with the jagged edges of human desire. This is the tragedy. In a world built on pride, envy, and hunger, goodness becomes fragile, ineffective, unprotected.
The novel ends with Mishkin's mind broken, sitting beside the corpse of the woman he could not save. It is Dostoevsky's bleakest question. What happens to a saint in a world that does not want salvation?
What Mishkin represents is the vulnerability of pure goodness. He walks through the world with an open heart, seeing the divine in everyone he meets, refusing to judge or condemn. And the world destroys him for it, not out of malice, but simply because brokenness cannot recognize wholeness when it appears. The people around Mishkin sense that he is different, that he sees them more clearly than they see themselves, and this clarity terrifies them. They want to be loved, but they cannot bear to be truly seen. Nastasia is one of the most heartbreaking characters Dostoevsky ever created. She is beautiful, intelligent, wounded beyond repair. As a child, she was sexually abused by the man who raised her. That wound became her identity. She cannot see herself as anything but ruined. So when Prince Mishkin offers her love, real, tender, unconditional love, she cannot accept it. Not because she doesn't want it, but because she doesn't believe she deserves it. She runs toward Rogozhin, a man who loves her with obsession, not tenderness. A man who will ultimately kill her, because destruction feels more honest than grace, because pain feels more familiar than healing. Dostoevsky understood that shame is a locked room, and the key is not willpower. The key is someone who loves you enough to sit outside the door and wait. But Nastasia cannot open the door. She has lived inside her shame for so long that she no longer remembers there was ever a time before it. What makes her tragedy so profound is that it is not about lack of love. It is about the inability to receive love. Mishkin offers her everything she has ever wanted, but she cannot take it. Her wound has convinced her that she is unworthy, and no amount of external affirmation can reach the place inside her that believes this lie. This is the cruelty of trauma. It does not just hurt you in the moment. It changes the way you see yourself forever. It creates a story about who you are, and that story becomes a prison you carry with you everywhere you go. If Mishkin is light, Parfen Rogozhin is shadow. He loves Nastasia, but not with tenderness, with obsession, fevered, possessive, violent. He would rather kill what he loves than allow anyone else to touch it. Rogozhin exists to show the monstrous side of human desire. Where Mishkin sees Nastasia's suffering and wishes to heal it, Rogozhin sees it and wishes to claim it. Their rivalry is not for a woman, it is for the human soul. Mishkin represents the possibility of redemption. Rogozhin represents the temptation of destruction. Dostoevsky understood that love has a shadow, a beautiful shadow, but a shadow nonetheless. Rogozhin's love is not less real than Mishkin's. It is simply unintegrated. It is desire without consciousness, passion without restraint, hunger without reverence. And in the end, it consumes what it cannot hold. The night Rogozhin kills Nastasia, he and Mishkin sit together beside her body in a scene of unbearable tenderness and horror. Two men who loved the same woman, two forms of love, one that wanted to save, one that wanted to possess. And neither could protect her from herself. What Rogozhin shows us is that love without integration becomes possession. When you love someone not as they are, but as you need them to be, when your desire for them overwhelms your respect for their autonomy, when your hunger for connection becomes indistinguishable from your hunger for control, that is when love turns monstrous. Rogozhin cannot let Nastasia go, not because he loves her too much, but because he has confused his need for her with love itself. And so he destroys the very thing he cannot bear to lose.
Love in Dostoevsky is never easy. It is not about happiness. It is about two people brave enough to see each other's darkness and stay. Love does not fix, it transforms through breaking. Sonia does not fix Raskolnikov. She breaks him open so grace can enter. Myshkin does not fix Nastasia. He shows her what she could have been, if she could have believed. Dostoevsky's love stories are not romantic in the modern sense. They are spiritual. They are about souls recognizing each other in the dark. And sometimes, often, that recognition is catastrophic. Because love demands that you see yourself clearly. And most people would rather die than do that.
What Dostoevsky understood is that love is the only force powerful enough to penetrate the defenses we build around our wounded hearts. Logic cannot reach the places where we are most broken. Willpower cannot heal the parts of us that have been shamed into silence. Only love, patient, persistent, unconditional love, can begin to dissolve the walls we have built to protect ourselves. But this kind of love is rare. It requires a willingness to be present with another person's pain without trying to fix it, explain it away, or rush them toward healing. This is why Sonia saves Raskolnikov when no one else can. Not because she is wiser or stronger, but because she is willing to sit with him in his guilt without flinching. This is why Myshkin sees Nastasia so clearly when everyone else sees only her beauty or her shame. He looks past the surface and sees the wounded child beneath. And this kind of seeing, this refusal to reduce another person to their worst moment or their most visible wound, is an act of love so radical it feels almost holy.
For Dostoevsky, love was the only force strong enough to break pride, the only truth powerful enough to shatter illusion, the only wound that could heal. But it required one thing: surrender. Not to another person, but to the truth of who you are. All of it. The lit rooms and the locked ones. The saint and the sinner. The part that longs for God and the part that runs from Him. Love, real love, is the willingness to be seen completely, even when it terrifies you. Now, we enter the most intellectually and emotionally devastating territory in all of Dostoevsky's work: the question of God. Not does God exist, but if God exists, why does He permit innocent suffering? This question is embodied in one of literature's most brilliant and tormented characters, Ivan Karamazov. Ivan is not an atheist in the simple sense. He does not reject God on scientific grounds. He rejects God on moral grounds. He tells his brother Alyosha, "It's not that I don't accept God, I just most respectfully return him the ticket." Ivan has collected stories of innocent children tortured by adults. A 5-year-old girl locked in an outhouse in the freezing cold, beaten, forced to eat her own excrement, praying to God for protection that never came. A general who orders his hunting dogs to tear apart a peasant boy because the child accidentally injured one of his hounds. Turkish soldiers throwing babies into the air and catching them on bayonets. These are not hypotheticals. These are real horrors, documented, historical, undeniable. And Ivan asks, what kind of God hears the prayers of tortured children and does nothing? The standard religious response is, God works in mysterious ways, or suffering serves a greater purpose, or there will be compensation in the afterlife. But Ivan rejects all of this as morally obscene. He says no greater good could possibly justify the torture of even one innocent child. If the achievement of some cosmic harmony requires a single child to suffer unjustly, then I want nothing to do with such harmony.
This is not atheism. This is rebellion, not against God's existence, but against God's justice.
What makes Ivan's rebellion so powerful is that it comes not from intellectual pride, but from moral outrage. He is not rejecting God because he wants to live without moral constraints. He is rejecting God because he cannot reconcile the idea of a loving, omnipotent deity with the reality of innocent suffering. This is the most honest form of doubt, not the doubt that comes from wanting to sin without consequence, but the doubt that comes from loving justice so much that you cannot accept a universe where it is absent. Ivan's rebellion culminates in one of the most famous passages in all of literature, the parable of the Grand Inquisitor. In this story within a story, Jesus returns to earth during the Spanish Inquisition. He performs miracles, heals the sick, and the people recognize him immediately. But the Grand Inquisitor, the highest authority of the Catholic Church, has him arrested. That night, the Inquisitor visits Jesus in his prison cell and delivers a long, devastating monologue. What makes Ivan's rebellion so powerful is that it comes not from intellectual pride, but from moral outrage. He is not rejecting God because he wants to live without moral constraints. He is rejecting God because he cannot reconcile the idea of a loving, omnipotent deity with the reality of innocent suffering. This is the most honest form of doubt, not the doubt that comes from wanting to sin without consequence, but the doubt that comes from loving justice so much that you cannot accept a universe where it is absent. Ivan's rebellion culminates in one of the most famous passages in all of literature, the parable of the Grand Inquisitor. In this story within a story, Jesus returns to earth during the Spanish Inquisition. He performs miracles, heals the sick, and the people recognize him immediately. But the Grand Inquisitor, the highest authority of the Catholic Church, has him arrested. That night, the Inquisitor visits Jesus in his prison cell and delivers a long, devastating monologue.
He says, "You offered humanity freedom, but freedom is a burden most people cannot bear." He argues that Jesus made a fundamental error in rejecting Satan's 3 temptations in the wilderness. First temptation, turn stones into bread. Jesus refused, saying, "Man does not live by bread alone." But the Inquisitor says, most people care more about survival than spirituality. By refusing to solve hunger, you condemned humanity to perpetual suffering. Second temptation, throw yourself from the temple and let angels save you. Jesus refused, insisting that faith must be freely chosen, not forced through miracles. But the Inquisitor says, most people are tormented by doubt. They desperately want certainty. By refusing to provide proof, you left humanity in agonizing uncertainty. Third temptation, rule over all the kingdoms of the earth. Jesus refused, saying his kingdom was not of this world. But the Inquisitor says, most people need strong leadership and clear social order. By refusing to establish a perfect earthly kingdom, you left humanity to chaos and war.
The Inquisitor concludes, "The Church has corrected your mistakes. We give people bread, miracles, and authority. We have taken away their terrible freedom and given them happiness instead." This is Dostoevsky's prophecy of totalitarianism, written decades before Stalin, before Hitler, before Mao. He understood that when people cannot bear the weight of freedom, they will surrender it to anyone who promises security. And those who promise security will become tyrants. What makes the Grand Inquisitor so chilling is that his argument is not obviously wrong. He claims to love humanity more than Jesus does, precisely because he understands human weakness.
Jesus demands that people rise to the challenge of freedom, that they take responsibility for their own souls, that they navigate moral ambiguity without the comfort of absolute certainty. But the Inquisitor argues that this is cruel, that most people are not strong enough for such freedom, that the loving thing to do is to relieve them of this burden.
Against Ivan's brilliant rebellion stands his younger brother, Alyosha. Alyosha is a monk, gentle, humble, deeply faithful. But his faith is not loud. It is not argumentative. It is the kind that stays when everything else leaves. Alyosha does not have better theological arguments than Ivan. He cannot explain why children suffer, but he chooses to trust in God's goodness anyway. Not because the evidence supports it, but because faith, for him, is a posture of the soul, a way of being in the world. When Ivan finishes his devastating parable, Alyosha's only response is to kiss his brother gently on the lips, just as Jesus, in the parable, kisses the Grand Inquisitor and then walks away in silence. The kiss says, "I hear you. I see your pain. I cannot argue with your logic, but I love you anyway." This is Dostoevsky's answer to the problem of suffering. Not an intellectual solution, but a presence, a willingness to sit beside someone in their doubt and not abandon them. What Alyosha represents is faith that has been tested by doubt and chosen anyway. He has heard every argument against God's goodness. He has witnessed suffering. He has felt the pull of despair. But he makes a conscious choice to trust in something beyond what he can see or understand. This is not naive faith. It is mature faith. Faith that knows its own fragility and holds on anyway. Alyosha's faith does not eliminate questions. It holds them without needing immediate answers. Dostoevsky himself was torn between Ivan and Alyosha. He wrote in his notebooks, "My Hosanna has passed through a great furnace of doubt." He did not arrive at faith easily. He wrestled with God, like Jacob wrestled the angel. He knew every argument against belief. He felt the full weight of innocent suffering. But he chose faith anyway, not as certainty, but as hope. Not because the world made sense, but because without God, the world was unbearable. He once wrote, "If someone proved to me that Christ is outside the truth, I would prefer to remain with Christ rather than with the truth." This is not intellectual surrender. This is existential commitment. He chose love over logic, mystery over mastery, grace over answers. Because he understood that some questions cannot be answered. They can only be lived through. And living through them requires something other than rational analysis. It requires faith in the possibility of meaning, even when meaning is not visible. What makes Dostoevsky's faith so compelling is that it emerged not from comfort, but from crisis. He stood before the firing squad and felt his life about to end. He spent 4 years in a Siberian prison witnessing cruelty and degradation. He suffered from epilepsy that brought him to the edge of consciousness and back. He knew poverty, grief, loss. His faith was not theoretical, it was existential. It was the choice he made every day to believe that his suffering had meaning, that the universe was not simply chaos and cruelty, but that love was stronger than death. There is a term in Christian mysticism, the dark night of the soul. It refers to the moment when God seems absent, when prayer feels empty, when faith feels like grasping at nothing. Dostoevsky lived in that darkness for years, and he emerged believing that the darkness was not abandonment, it was initiation. That doubt was not the opposite of faith, it was the refining fire that made faith real. Because faith that has never doubted is not faith, it is comfort. But faith that has doubted deeply and chosen to believe anyway, that is faith worth having. The dark night is not a crisis to be solved, but a passage to be walked through. It is the place where easy answers die and deeper truth begins to emerge. It is where you learn that faith is not about having all the answers, it is about continuing to ask questions even when no answers come. It is about holding the tension between what you hope is true and what you fear might be true, and choosing to live as if hope is real.
Dostoevsky's characters who achieve any measure of peace are those who learn to live in this tension. They do not resolve the contradiction between faith and doubt. They hold both at once. They do not eliminate suffering. They learn to suffer consciously, to transform pain into meaning rather than letting it destroy them. They do not achieve certainty. They achieve trust, which is something deeper and more resilient than certainty could ever be. Dostoevsky did not solve the question of God. He lived inside it, and that wrestling, that refusal to look away from the question, even when it burned, is what makes his work holy, not because he had answers, but because he refused to accept easy ones.
In 1872, Dostoevsky published a novel that most of his contemporaries dismissed as hysterical overreaction. It was called Demons, sometimes translated as The Devils or The Possessed. It tells the story of a group of young radicals in a provincial Russian town who become infected with violent political ideologies. They believe they are fighting for justice, for progress, for liberation, but slowly their ideas begin to unravel their sanity. They descend into manipulation, conspiracy, betrayal, murder, suicide. Dostoevsky wrote them as if each ideology was a demon whispering in the ear, not metaphysically, but psychologically. Ideas that begin as promises, end as graves. The novel was ignored, dismissed as paranoid fantasy. And then, 50 years later, the Russian Revolution happened, and everything Dostoevsky predicted came true. The ideological violence, the betrayals, the purges, the millions dead in the name of utopia. Demons is not fiction, it is prophecy.
What Dostoevsky saw with terrifying clarity is that the 20th century would be dominated not by religious wars, but by ideological ones. He understood that when people lose faith in God, they do not simply become secular and rational. They transferred their religious impulse onto political movements. They began to worship ideas instead of deities, to see history as a sacred narrative, to divide the world into the saved and the damned. And once politics becomes religion, compromise becomes heresy, and violence becomes sacrament. Dostoevsky understood something that most intellectuals of his time refused to see. Ideas can possess you like spirits, not literally, but psychologically. An ideology is a voice that says, "You are righteous. Everyone else is the problem." It gives you certainty in an uncertain world. It gives you meaning when life feels meaningless. It gives you permission to hate because your hatred is justified. And once an idea replaces conscience, anything becomes permissible.
The characters in Demons begin with genuine concern for social injustice, but their commitment to ideological purity gradually overwhelms their basic human decency. They become willing to lie, steal, and murder because they have convinced themselves that their personal feelings and moral scruples are obstacles to the greater good. They develop elaborate theories to justify actions they would have considered evil before their conversion. This is the psychology of fanaticism. You become so identified with an idea that you lose the ability to see yourself clearly. The idea becomes your identity, and anyone who questions the idea becomes an enemy. What makes ideological possession so dangerous is that it feels like enlightenment.
The person who has been possessed by an ideology experiences a sense of clarity, purpose, and moral certainty that is intoxicating. They feel that they have finally understood the truth that everyone else is too blind or corrupt to see.
This sense of special knowledge creates a psychological barrier between them and the rest of humanity. They begin to see other people not as individuals, but as categories: oppressor or oppressed, enlightened or ignorant, ally or enemy. Dostoevsky shows us that this process is gradual. No one wakes up one morning and decides to become a fanatic. It begins with legitimate grievances and genuine compassion. But slowly, the ideas they adopt to make sense of injustice begin to reshape how they see the world. Nuance disappears. Complexity is reduced to binary opposition. People become symbols rather than souls. And eventually, the fanatic reaches a point where they are willing to sacrifice real human beings for the sake of abstract principles. This brings us back to Raskolnikov. His crime was not just murder. His crime was believing in a theory more than he believed in his own humanity. He convinced himself that extraordinary men had the right to transcend moral boundaries. He thought of Napoleon, of conquerors, of great men who break bodies to build history, and he decided to test whether he was extraordinary. The theory gave him permission, but the body knew better. The soul knew better. After the murder, Raskolnikov's psyche revolts. Not because society tells him he was wrong, but because something deeper, something he cannot reason away, knows that he has violated a fundamental law of human existence. This is what Dostoevsky understood about ideology. It can convince your conscious mind of almost anything, but it cannot silence the deeper wisdom of the soul. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. Conscience operates at a level beneath rationalization. Raskolnikov's theory was not wrong because it was illogical. It was wrong because it was inhuman. It treated human life as if it were material to be used in service of a higher purpose. It reduced a living, breathing person to an obstacle to be removed. And the moment he acted on this theory, his entire being rebelled against what he had done. This is the tragedy of ideological thinking. It gives you permission to do things that your soul knows are wrong. And then you must live with the consequences.
In Demons, Dostoevsky creates a character named Shigalov, who develops a complete system for reorganizing society. Shigalov begins with the goal of creating perfect equality and freedom for all humanity, but when he works out the practical implications of his ideas, he discovers something horrifying. Perfect equality requires the complete elimination of individual freedom. His ideal society would divide humanity into two groups, a small elite who would make all decisions, and a large mass who would live in conditions of perfect equality but complete subservience. Shigalov presents this not as a betrayal of his original ideals, but as their logical fulfillment. He says, "Starting from unlimited freedom, I arrive at unlimited despotism." This is Dostoevsky's most chilling insight into the nature of utopian thinking. The road to totalitarianism is paved with dreams of perfect equality. Every attempt to create heaven on earth ends up creating hell, precisely because it tries to eliminate the messy, unpredictable reality of human freedom.
What Shigalov represents is the moment when ideology becomes honest about its own implications. Most revolutionaries never reach this point of clarity. They continue to believe that their violent methods are temporary measures on the way to a peaceful utopia. But Shigalov has thought through his system to its logical conclusion and realized that utopia requires tyranny. And rather than abandoning his system, he embraces this conclusion. This is the ultimate corruption.
when you become so committed to an idea that you are willing to accept its monstrous implications rather than question the idea itself. Dostoevsky wrote this character in the 1870s. 50 years later, the Soviet Union would implement almost exactly the system Shigalov described. The promise of perfect equality, the division of society into a revolutionary vanguard and the masses, the elimination of individual freedom in service of collective happiness. Lenin, Stalin, and the entire apparatus of Soviet totalitarianism followed the blueprint that Dostoevsky had prophetically sketched in a novel that was dismissed as paranoid exaggeration.
What makes ideology so seductive is not primarily its content, but its promise of certainty. In a world that is complex, ambiguous, and often incomprehensible, ideology offers a clear explanation for everything. It tells you who is to blame for suffering, what must be done to end it, and what the future will look like once the revolution succeeds. This clarity is psychologically intoxicating, especially for young people who are just beginning to grapple with the overwhelming complexity of the world. Dostoevsky understood that human beings have a deep need for meaning, and when traditional sources of meaning collapse, people will grasp at whatever narrative gives their lives purpose and direction. In his time, the traditional sources of meaning were religion, family, community, and social hierarchy. But modernity was systematically undermining all of these. Science challenged religious beliefs. Industrialization fractured communities. Social mobility disrupted traditional hierarchies. People were left unmoored, searching for something to believe in.
Into this vacuum rushed political ideologies that functioned as substitute religions. They had their own creation myths, the original state of equality before the rise of private property, their own fall narratives, the emergence of class society, their own redemption stories, the coming revolution, and their own visions of paradise, the classless society of the future. They even had their own rituals, saints, and martyrs. For people who could no longer believe in traditional religion, these ideologies provided all the psychological benefits of faith: meaning, purpose, community, moral clarity, without requiring belief in anything supernatural. But there was a cost. Traditional religions, at their best, recognized the limits of human knowledge and the inevitability of mystery. They acknowledged that some questions cannot be answered, that suffering cannot always be explained, and that the universe contains depths that human reason cannot plumb. Political ideologies, by contrast, claimed to have complete explanations for everything. They promised that once their system was implemented, all problems would be solved, all suffering would end, all questions would be answered. This promise was a lie, and the attempt to make it true would cost millions of lives.
One of the most disturbing aspects of Demons is the way Dostoevsky shows violence emerging from people who sincerely believe they are serving humanity. The revolutionary characters are not sadists or psychopaths. They are idealists who have convinced themselves that the ends justify the means. They tell themselves that the violence they commit today is necessary to prevent greater violence in the future, that the people they kill are obstacles to a more just society, that their own suffering and moral compromise are noble sacrifices for the greater good. Dostoevsky understood that the most dangerous people are not those who know they are doing evil, but those who believe they are doing good. A person who knows he is committing murder will at least feel guilt, which creates a psychological limit on how much evil he can commit. But a person who believes his murders are acts of justice feels no such restraint. He can kill with a clear conscience because he has framed his violence as virtue. And once violence becomes virtuous, there is no limit to how much of it can be justified.
This is why Dostoevsky saw ideological thinking as spiritually catastrophic. It does not just permit evil, it sanctifies evil. It transforms murder into heroism, betrayal into loyalty, destruction into progress. The revolutionary who kills in the name of justice is more dangerous than the criminal who kills for personal gain, because the revolutionary has no internal brake on his violence. He has convinced himself that every atrocity brings the world closer to paradise. The characters in Demons demonstrate this progression with terrifying clarity. They begin by justifying small violations of conscience. Lying to bourgeois society does not count as lying because bourgeois morality is itself a lie. They move to justifying property destruction. Stealing from the wealthy is not theft because private property is theft. They progress to justifying violence against individuals. Killing oppressors is not murder because the oppressors are themselves murderers. And finally, they reach a point where any action, no matter how monstrous, can be justified as long as it serves the revolution.
The title Demons is significant. Dostoevsky did not mean that his characters were literally possessed by supernatural entities. He meant that they had surrendered their moral autonomy to ideas that had taken control of their minds. They were no longer thinking for themselves. The ideology was thinking through them. They were no longer making free choices. The ideology was making choices for them. They had become instruments of a force they no longer controlled. This is what possession means in psychological terms: the loss of the ability to reflect critically on the thoughts in your own head. When you are possessed by an ideology, you cannot step back and ask whether the voice you are hearing is actually yours or whether it belongs to something that has colonized your mind. You experience the ideology's judgments as your own judgments, its desires as your own desires, its hatreds as your own hatreds. You have become, in a very real sense, a vessel for something other than yourself.
Jung would later call this identification with the archetype the moment when a person becomes inflated by a psychological force larger than their individual ego. When someone identifies with the archetype of the savior, they begin to believe they can redeem the world. When someone identifies with the archetype of the hero, they begin to believe they must fight a cosmic battle against evil. These identifications are dangerous precisely because they feel true. They give the person a sense of significance and purpose that is intoxicating. But they also blind the person to their own shadow, to the ways in which their heroic actions are causing harm. Dostoevsky's revolutionaries are possessed by archetypal forces they do not understand. They believe they are agents of history, warriors for justice, prophets of a new world. But in reality, they are acting out ancient patterns of scapegoating, tribalism, and violence that are as old as humanity itself. The ideology has not made them more enlightened, it has made them more primitive. It has stripped away the civilizing restraints of conscience, empathy, and doubt, leaving only the raw will to power. Demons is Dostoevsky's warning to the future. He saw where the intellectual currents of his time were leading, and he tried to sound the alarm. He knew that the combination of atheism, materialism, and utopian thinking would produce movements that would treat human beings as raw material for social engineering projects. He knew that the loss of traditional moral constraints would not lead to liberation, but to unprecedented cruelty. He knew that ideas have consequences, and the ideas that were gaining popularity in European intellectual circles would have catastrophic consequences. His contemporaries dismissed him as a reactionary, a religious fanatic, a paranoid alarmist. But history proved him right. The 20th century became the century of ideology, the century of mass murder in service of abstract principles, the century of utopian projects that turned into genocidal nightmares. Stalin's purges, Hitler's concentration camps, Mao's cultural revolution, Pol Pot's killing fields, all of these horrors emerged from ideological thinking, from the belief that human beings could be perfected through the right social system, from the willingness to sacrifice millions of real people for the sake of theoretical futures.
Dostoevsky tried to tell us that this would happen. He wrote demons as a warning, but warnings are only useful if people listen to them. And most people did not listen until it was too late. The demon of ideology did not die in the 20th century. It simply changed its language. It still whispers in every movement that promises to perfect humanity, in every system that claims to have complete answers, in every voice that tells you the world can be divided cleanly into oppressors and oppressed, enlightened and ignorant, saved and damned. Dostoevsky's warning remains relevant because the human temptation he diagnosed, the desire to escape the burden of moral ambiguity by surrendering to a totalizing system of thought, remains constant.
Raskolnikov does confess, not with heroism, not with clarity, but with the exhausted surrender of a man who can no longer carry the weight of his own heartbeat. He is sent to Siberia, the same Siberia that once broke Dostoevsky. There, he tries to remain proud, cold, unrepentant. But Sonia follows him, visits him, reads to him, shows him the tenderness he cannot show himself. And in the final pages, Raskolnikov breaks. Dostoevsky writes, "The past was washed away from his soul. He looked out at life around him with new eyes." Moral transformation in Dostoevsky is not intellectual. It is not logical. It is a slow, painful thawing of a frozen heart. Suffering is not punishment. It is purification. This is the philosophy he forged in the furnace of prison and poured into every novel thereafter. Confession is the moment when the lie ends and life begins again. Not because confession earns forgiveness, but because confession is the act of finally telling the truth to yourself.
What makes confession redemptive is not that it changes what you have done, it changes your relationship to what you have done. Before confession, you are divided against yourself. Part of you knows the truth, and part of you is desperately trying to hide it. This internal division creates a kind of spiritual paralysis. You cannot move forward because you are constantly expending energy to maintain the lie. Confession ends this division. It brings the hidden thing into the light, and in the light, it can finally be addressed. Jung understood this same principle when he wrote about the integration of the shadow. The shadow is not integrated through repression or denial, it is integrated through acknowledgement. You must look at the parts of yourself you have been refusing to see. You must name them, claim them, accept that they are yours. This does not mean celebrating them or acting on them. It means ending the exhausting work of pretending they do not exist. And once you stop pretending, something in you can finally rest.
Raskolnikov's confession is not primarily a legal act, it is a psychological one. When he finally admits out loud what he has been carrying in silence, the fever breaks. Not immediately, not completely, but gradually, like ice melting in spring. The soul has its own timeline, its own process of healing. You cannot force it or rush it. You can only stop resisting it. And confession is the moment when resistance ends. Dostoevsky wrote about prostitutes, gamblers, murderers, alcoholics, and failures. He did not write about them from a distance as objects of pity or moral instruction. He wrote about them from inside their experience, with a profound respect for their humanity. He understood that no one is beyond grace, that the soul does not die, it only hides. He saw halos on beggars. He knew that the people society discards are often the ones who understand suffering most deeply, and therefore understand redemption most truly.
This is why his most spiritually advanced characters are often his most socially degraded ones. Sonia, the prostitute, has more spiritual wisdom than any of the educated intellectuals in Crime and Punishment. The prisoner who befriends Dostoevsky in Siberia, despite being a convicted murderer, shows him more human kindness than the guards. Father Zosima, the monk whose teachings represent Dostoevsky's own spiritual vision, emphasizes that the soul is revealed not in success, but in failure, not in strength, but in weakness. What Dostoevsky recognized is that suffering strips away the social masks we wear. When you have lost everything, when you have been reduced to nothing in the eyes of the world, you can no longer hide behind status, accomplishments, or respectability. You are forced to confront who you are when all of those external markers are removed. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, this stripping away reveals something luminous underneath. The person who has been broken and rebuilt is often more whole than the person who has never been tested.
This does not mean that suffering automatically makes people better. Dostoevsky was too honest to believe that. Suffering can also make people bitter, cruel, and destroyed. The underground man is proof of that. The difference lies not in the suffering itself, but in how it is received. If suffering is met with resentment and self-pity, it becomes poison. If it is met with acceptance and the willingness to be changed, it becomes medicine. The same fire that purifies one person destroys another. The difference is not in the heat, but in the material. Pain is not the goal. Transformation is. Dostoevsky did not glorify suffering for its own sake. He understood that suffering is terrible, that it destroys lives, that it should be alleviated wherever possible. But he also understood that it is unavoidable, and that the question is not whether you will suffer, but what you will do with the suffering when it comes. You can let it embitter you, or you can let it deepen you. You can let it close your heart, or you can let it break your heart open.
The mythic pattern Dostoevsky traces in his novels is the pattern of descent and return, the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell would later identify as universal to human storytelling. The hero must go down into the underworld before he can return transformed. He must face the dragon, enter the cave, descend into hell. This descent is not optional. It is the price of consciousness, the cost of becoming fully human. You cannot skip this part of the journey and arrive at wholeness. You must go through the fire. Raskolnikov's descent is his fever, his paranoia, his spiritual collapse. Myshkin's descent is his epilepsy, his suffering, his final breakdown. Alyosha's descent is his doubt, his grief over Father Zosima's death, his crisis of faith. Each of them must enter the darkness before they can emerge into whatever light awaits them. And not all of them emerge intact. Some, like Myshkin, are destroyed by the descent. But even his destruction has a kind of nobility to it. He was destroyed by trying to love in a world that did not know how to receive love. What Dostoevsky shows us is that the descent is not failure, it is preparation. You go down so that you can learn things that can only be learned in the dark. You break so that you can be rebuilt in a truer form. You die so that you can be resurrected. This is the oldest pattern in human spirituality, and Dostoevsky understood it not as abstract theology, but as lived experience. He had died and been reborn. He knew what it felt like to stand at the edge of your own ending and then return to life. And he spent the rest of his years writing about that experience in 1,000 different forms. The soul in Dostoevsky's vision is not simple. It is not pure. It is not easily categorized into good and evil. It is contradictory, capable of both profound love and profound cruelty, often at the same time. It is a battlefield where impulses war with each other, where conscious intentions collide with unconscious drives, where the desire for God wrestles with the desire to be God. And this battle never ends. There is no final victory in this life, no moment when you can rest assured that you have become purely good and will never again be tempted by darkness.
But the battle is worth fighting, not because you will win, you will not completely, but because the act of fighting is itself what makes you human. The person who no longer struggles with his own darkness has either achieved sainthood, which is vanishingly rare, or has stopped paying attention, which is common. Most of us exist in the messy middle, trying to be better while constantly failing, picking ourselves up after each fall, learning slowly and painfully what it means to live with integrity in a world that does not reward integrity. Dostoevsky believed that the soul was sacred not because it was perfect, but because it was capable of recognizing its own imperfection and choosing to struggle towards something better anyway. The murderer who feels remorse is more human than the self-righteous person who cannot see his own capacity for evil. The prostitute who loves selflessly is holier than the priest who judges her. The broken person who continues to hope is braver than the comfortable person who has never been tested. The measure of a soul is not whether it has sinned. All souls have sinned, but whether it can still love, still hope, still believe in the possibility of redemption.
Jung's concept of individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating all aspects of yourself, including those you have rejected, is essentially what Dostoevsky dramatized in narrative form. His characters who achieve any measure of peace are those who stop trying to eliminate their darkness and instead learn to integrate it consciously. They acknowledge their capacity for evil without being controlled by it. They accept their wounds without being defined by them. They hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into one side or the other. This is what Raskolnikov finally learns in Siberia. He does not become a saint. He does not lose his capacity for pride or cruelty. But he learns to see these things in himself clearly, to acknowledge them without justifying them, to accept that he is capable of both murder and love. And in that acceptance, something in him settles. The war is not over, but it is no longer tearing him apart. He has learned to live with the contradiction of being human.
Alyosha represents this integration from the beginning. He is a monk, devoted to God, yet he does not reject the world or the flesh. He loves people not despite their sins, but including their sins. He can hold the tension between faith and doubt, between idealism and realism, between the sacred and the profane. He is whole not because he has eliminated one side of the equation, but because he has learned to hold both sides at once. This is the goal Dostoevsky holds out for us. Not perfection, but integration. Not the elimination of darkness, but the conscious relationship with darkness. Not the escape from suffering, but the transformation of suffering into wisdom. Not the achievement of certainty, but the development of the capacity to live with uncertainty without falling into despair. This is what it means to become fully human, not to transcend your limitations, but to embrace them as part of what you are.
And finally, there is grace. Dostoevsky believed that all of this, the suffering, the confession, the integration, the transformation, was not something you could achieve through willpower alone. You could prepare yourself for it, you could open yourself to it, you could stop resisting it. But the actual moment of transformation came from somewhere beyond your conscious control. It was a gift, not an achievement. Grace. Grace is what happens when Raskolnikov finally breaks and weeps. Grace is what Sonya offers when she sits beside him without judgment. Grace is what allows the underground man to write his confession, even though he knows it will change nothing. Grace is the epileptic ecstasy that Dostoevsky experienced before his seizures, those moments when the boundaries of self dissolved and he felt connected to everything. Grace is the possibility that redemption is real, that transformation is possible, that love is stronger than death.
You cannot earn grace. You cannot force it. You cannot predict when it will come. All you can do is live with as much honesty and openness as you can manage, and trust that when you have descended as far as you can go, something will catch you. Not always, not guaranteed, but sometimes. And that possibility, that fragile, uncertain possibility, is what makes the struggle worthwhile. Dostoevsky did not write to entertain. He wrote to save. And anyone who has ever felt broken knows what I mean. His work does not offer comfort. It offers company. It says, you are not alone in the darkest room of your soul. I have been there too, and I return to tell you that the room has a door. You can open it. You can walk out. You can begin again.
Some writers teach you how to think. Dostoevsky teaches you how to feel. He does not give you theories about the human condition. He places you inside it. Inside the fever and the trembling, inside the guilt and the longing, inside the darkness and the desperate reach toward light. His novels are not stories you read. They are experiences you survive. And when you emerge from them, something in you has changed. Not because you have learned new information, but because you have been forced to confront truths about yourself you had been avoiding. He stands with the broken, the ashamed, the desperate, the lost. He does not stand above them, analyzing them from a safe distance. He stands among them, one wounded soul speaking to others. And he says, you are still here. That means something. Your suffering is not meaningless. Your guilt is not the end of your story. Your darkness is not the only thing that defines you. You are more than your worst moment. You are more than your deepest wound. You are capable of transformation, capable of love, capable of grace.
This is why his work endures. Not because it is beautiful, though it is. Not because it is intellectually sophisticated, though it is. But because it speaks to the part of you that you keep hidden, the part that is afraid and ashamed and desperate to be seen anyway. Dostoevsky sees you. He sees the rooms you have locked inside yourself, the guilt you carry in silence, the love you are afraid to offer, the redemption you do not believe you deserve. And he tells you, open the door. It is dark in there, yes, it is frightening, but you cannot heal what you refuse to see. Jung gave us the map of the psyche, the ego, the shadow, the self, the process of individuation. Dostoevsky gave us the experience, the fever, the trembling, the collapse, the slow, agonizing return to wholeness. Jung systematized what Dostoevsky dramatized. Both understood that the psyche is not a machine you can control through willpower, that what you repress does not disappear but goes underground and gathers strength, that wholeness is achieved not by eliminating the shadow, but by integrating it, by learning to hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into one side or the other.
The soul is a house with locked rooms. This is not just a poetic metaphor. It is a precise description of how the psyche operates. Every part of yourself that you reject gets locked away in a room you refuse to enter. And those rejected parts do not sit quietly. They bang on the walls. They whisper through the vents. They show up in your dreams, your compulsions, your irrational reactions. And eventually, If you refuse to open the door, they break it down. Dostoevsky's characters are people who have locked too many rooms for too long, and the novels are about what happens when those doors finally shatter. He believed in suffering, not as an end in itself, but as a path. Pain carves away the false self, and what remains is truer than what you started with. He believed in confession, not as a legal admission, but as a psychological breakthrough, the moment when the lie ends and life begins again. He believed in love, not as comfort, but as catastrophe, as the force that breaks you open so grace can enter. He believed in redemption, not as something you earn, but as something you receive, a gift that comes when you have finally stopped running from yourself.
He believed in God, but not easily, not simply, not without doubt. His faith was forged in the furnace of suffering, tempered by the fires of doubt, tested by the weight of innocent suffering. He prayed with one hand and doubted with the other. And that tension, that refusal to choose between faith and honesty, is what made his spiritual vision so powerful. He did not solve the question of God. He lived inside it. And that wrestling, that refusal to look away from the question even when it burned, is what makes his work holy. His prophecies came true. Demons predicted the ideological violence of the 20th century with terrifying accuracy. The Grand Inquisitor predicted totalitarianism before Stalin was born. His psychological insights anticipated Freud and Jung by decades. His exploration of the divided self laid the groundwork for existentialism before Sartre or Camus were conceived. He saw the modern world coming, the loss of faith, the rise of ideology, the fragmentation of the self, the crisis of meaning, and he tried to warn us. Some listened, most did not.
But his legacy is not primarily prophetic, it is pastoral. He wrote for the broken, and we are all broken. He wrote for those who carry guilt they cannot speak, and we all carry such guilt. He wrote for those who doubt, who struggle, who fail, who long for redemption but do not believe they deserve it. He wrote for anyone who has ever stood in a locked room inside their own soul and wondered if they would ever find the key. The key is confession. The key is acknowledging what you have been refusing to see. The key is opening the door and walking into the darkness, trusting that something, grace, love, God, the self, will meet you there. This is the pattern Dostoevsky traced in every novel: descent and return, death and resurrection, breaking and healing. You must go down before you can rise. You must break before you can integrate. You must confess before you can be whole. And the descent is not failure. It is preparation. You go down so that you can learn things that can only be learned in the dark. You break so that you can be rebuilt in a truer form. You die so that you can be resurrected. A candle in a snow-covered window, flickering but not extinguished. This is the image Dostoevsky leaves us with. Not the triumph of light over darkness, but the persistence of light within darkness. The refusal to go out even when the wind howls. The small, stubborn flame that continues to burn because it has no choice, because burning is what it does, because even the smallest light matters in the deepest dark. He believed in grace, not because the world deserved it, but because without it, we would all be lost. Not because he could prove it, but because he had felt it. In the moment before his execution, when life suddenly became precious, in the midst of his epileptic ecstasies, when the boundaries of self dissolved,
in the presence of those who loved him when he could not love himself, in the act of writing itself, which was his way of transforming suffering into meaning.
His work is a gift to anyone who has ever felt that life is too heavy to carry. It does not make the weight lighter, but it reminds you that others have carried such weight and survived, that your burden is not unique, that the act of carrying it is itself a form of courage. It tells you that brokenness can be holy, that suffering can be transformative, that even the darkest room has a door. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky died in St. Petersburg on February 9, 1881. Tens of thousands attended his funeral, a spontaneous outpouring of love from ordinary people who felt that he had spoken for them, that he had seen their suffering and given it dignity. He was buried at Tikhvin Cemetery in the Alexander Nevsky Monastery, and on his gravestone are inscribed the words of Christ, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit."
He fell into the ground. He died many times, in many ways, at the execution that did not kill his body but killed his innocence, in the Siberian prison that broke him open, in the seizures that brought him to the edge of consciousness and back, in the poverty, the grief, the endless struggle. And from that dying, he brought forth fruit, novels that continue to speak to the broken, to offer company in the dark, to remind us that redemption is possible, even when it seems impossible. This is his final gift, the knowledge that you are not alone, that the room you are most afraid to enter has been entered before, that the darkness you carry has been carried by others, that the question you cannot answer has been asked by souls greater than yours, that the wound that defines you does not have to destroy you, that brokenness can become wholeness, that death can become resurrection, that suffering can become grace. He wrote from the wound, and the wound still speaks.